The first assessment here is simply setup at address. While there's no such thing as perfect posture, there's certainly extreme tendencies you want to avoid. The first one we'll see here is C posture, or excessive flexion, which will make rotation and raising of the arms very difficult. The next one we go into is S posture, or excessive extension, which puts a lot of stress on the low back and also makes rotation of the hips very difficult. Finally, then we have the knee loader with vertical spine, again, which will make it very difficult to make a good golf swing. Next, we go into pelvic tilt, which looks at the control and mobility at your pelvis and hips. So the back needs to be able to go through anterior and posterior pelvic tilt during the swing. If you can't do that, it makes it much more difficult to get good rotation and also maintain any type of posture throughout the swing. It tends to lead to standing up early, also known as losing your posture, sway or slide, or early extension. Just going to show you some of the flaws that we often see in this movement then, generally from lack of control, not knowing how to move, adjust your low back and hips. People often move at their knees, they often stand up taller with their spine angle, and sometimes they're actually just locked into place, they can't get anything to move. Oftentimes people can move, but they have a very, very shaky movement, which was just shown, and then sometimes people move their thoracic spine and their shoulders instead. The next one looks at the ability to separate your pelvis and hips. It's called pelvic rotation. So very simple, you're trying to see, can you rotate your pelvis while keeping your chest square? That's vital for separation and what some people call sequence, which is important for how you start the downswing. So people who can't separate their pelvis rotation from their torso rotation often struggle with things like over the top and also developing power. This is a classic example of how many people do it. They try and snap their knees back and forth rather than being able to turn at their hips. Another common mistake is people turning their chest and hips together, demonstrating that they don't have a good idea of how to separate one segment from the other. And then finally, you see people who shift their hips laterally too much side to side rather than rotation. The next one is the opposite of that. It's called torso rotation. So for this, we're trying to keep our lower half still and just rotate at our chest and torso. We're not overly concerned with how far you can turn your shoulders here. More so, are you able to separate your torso or chest rotation, or shoulder turn as most people would call it, while the lower body stays still. Some of the common mistakes here are quite similar to the ones we see in the pelvis rotation. So you have everything moving together. You have people losing their shoulder plane and turning with too flat an angle, which often shows up in their golf swing. So be everything moving together. And then we also have people who sway too much laterally from side to side. So they shift laterally rather than rotating on their axis. The next one we have is the overhead squat, which is a really good test of mobility in the ankles, hips and shoulders, and also trunk stability. So the setup for this is really important. You want to have your toes straight ahead and your feet about the same width of your shoulders. Then you're going to squat down as low as you can, keeping your heels on the ground, and you want to keep your the stick behind your toe line, which will be easier to see from the side view. Okay, so from this view, what we're trying to have happen here is the heels stay on the ground, and as I squat down, we don't want the stick to go forward past my toes. So in my bottom position here, I'm borderline. I've actually probably had the stick go slightly past my toes. I'm going to show you a couple of examples of how people often try and cheat or get this exercise wrong. So the first one you'll notice is the feet spinning open, which greatly reduces the mobility demands for the ankle and the hip, as the knees don't need to travel as far forward to allow you drop down while keeping your torso upright. The next common mistake we have here is where people just load their knees. they don't have the understanding or they don't have the mobility to try and sit back into their hips. Usually not a mobility problem, usually more so the understanding and control in the exercise. So they're told to stay upright, so the only thing that they do is push their knees forward. They don't sit back into their hips. The next one would be almost the opposite of that, people falling too far forward with their trunk. And you'll notice by looking at the side of this one that the stick just travels way too far forward and people don't stay upright at all. You notice how less forward the knees have traveled in this exercise or in this example. That's often a sign of limited ankle mobility. The next one we have then is people just coming up onto their toes. So if they don't have a good understanding of loading in their feet and balance, they allow the knees drift so far forward that the heels come up off the ground. You see that this allows me to stay really, really upright, but it's a very dangerous position for the knees. Then we're going to move on to the toe touch, which looks at your ability to hip hinge and looks at some of the mobility throughout the posterior side of your body, like the calves, hamstrings, low back, mid back, and also the neck. So for this one, we want feet together. You're going to put one hand over the other, and then simply from here, keeping your legs straight, you're going to try and hinge over and touch your toes. A common issue I see with this is people aren't used to loading weight back into their hips, and they try and get most of their movement from their thoracic spine or mid-back. So you notice in this one, my hips haven't shifted back far enough, and I'm solely trying to hinge from my mid-back upwards, and I can't get nearly as much mobility. Really common in people who have exaggerated S posture or too much lordotic curve in their low back. The second one then is really common, which is just people bending their knees to take the stretch and load off the rear side of their body and make it a little bit easier for them to drop down. Next, we have the lower quarter rotation, which looks at the rotation ability of your lower body, particularly internal and external hip rotation, which are very important for both the backswing and downswing. So you'll notice here I have a 6 iron and I've just put the sole of the 6 iron resting along the alignment rod on the ground. I've lined one foot up straight ahead with the camera and so that'll be my right foot, and then my left foot is up on the ball of my foot. From here, I'm going to clamp the stick just below my belt line, make sure both hands keep it firm against my hips, and then I'm trying to rotate so that the stick on my hips gets as far as the stick that's on the ground. So now I'm just going to move the stick, turn the golf club around so I can test the other side. So what we're looking at here, when my left foot is down and I'm turning left, this is internal rotation on my left hip. And again, hopefully that stick that's along my hips can get in line with the shaft that's on the ground, which would signify a 60-degree rotation. And then this is external rotation on my right hip. People who struggle with the mobility in this test are often people who sway in the backswing and slide in the downswing or early extend towards the ball. Just showing a couple of common errors here. The main would be people allowing the stick come off one hip to make it look like they've turned further than they actually have. The next one is seated torso rotation. So for this, you need some sort of box or bench, and you need to make a 90-degree angle. So if you turn the corner of the box, it's very, very simple then to make a 90-degree axis on the ground with 2 shafts or 2 alignment rods. So I'm going to sit right in the middle of the X. I'm going to have my ankles and knees together. And then from here, I'm just going to place the golf club across my shoulders. What I'm trying to see here when I rotate to the right is, has the shaft across my shoulders gotten to parallel or past the orange shaft on the ground? That would signify 45 degrees of torso rotation, which we'd like to have as a minimum. And then it's the same thing here going to the left. I'm going to show you a couple of ways that people fall into problems with this test. So you'll see I just slouched down and lost a couple of inches in height, and my rotation is hugely decreased. And this is the same thing that happens in people when they have too much C posture or flexion in their setup position. So you'll notice here I'm sitting nice and upright, so almost like an elongated spine, and it's quite easy for me to rotate. Then when I slouch around or go into too much flexion, my rotation is hugely cut off. Another way people try and cheat this test or don't get an accurate representation is they have their feet too far apart and allow their lower body move, which makes it much easier to gain extra range of motion. So feet and knees together, up nice and tall, and then rotating as far as we can each side. This one is external shoulder rotation. So this is particularly important for the trail hand or right hand of right-handed golfers. Very simple. You're trying to get your elbow to the same height as your shoulder and then rotate your forearm towards the ceiling. What you're looking for is the ability to get your forearm to match your spine angle. We do it standing and then also in golf posture. Oftentimes it's more difficult in golf postures. The mobility demands are increased. Issues with external shoulder rotation in the trail arm can cause problems for shaft pitch in the downswing. It can often be much too vertical or steep. Some of the common mistakes you see in this are people moving their elbow too far back behind them rather than just rotating through the shoulder, or overextending through their mid back and spine. From there, we're going to move on to shoulder flexion. So I'm just illustrating here that you want to keep the low back flat against the ground. Pulling your knees into your chest will help this. You're going to have your hands straight up to the ceiling with your thumbs up, and then we're trying to reach back and get our hands to touch the ground behind our head. Very important that the elbows stay locked out in this exercise and that you do not allow the low back arch up off the ground. So really important one for checking shoulder and lat flexibility, which is very important for being able to get your arms into a nice good position at the top of the backswing and generate some power. So I'm just demonstrating some elbow bending in the last couple of reps, which is a cheat to take some of the demand off the lats and triceps. And another common one is people allowing their hands get too wide. The single leg balance. So for this, you're going to start with your feet together, raise one leg up so that the knee is the same height as the hip. And once you feel like you have your balance set, you're going to close your eyes, which is a really good test of what's called proprioception, and forces you to try and maintain balance by the feel through your feet as opposed to being able to use vision. So we do it on both sides. You get 3 attempts on each side. It's usually much harder than it looks. People often find this very difficult. The first flaw, or the first mistake that I'm going to show you a lot of people make is they try and close their eyes before they have their balance set, and they never get a chance to stabilize before closing their eyes. So people often think that it's okay if they jump around, they haven't completely lost their balance. So for this test, you're trying to only count how many seconds you get while you're remaining pretty much motionless. Your arms need to stay by your side and you can't be moving around too much. So this would be the side view. Common mistake when looking at the side is people hinge over or hunch over too much to try and make it a little bit easier. Then we're going to move on to cervical rotation or neck rotation. So very simple. You're going to stand up nice and tall. Then with your mouth closed, you're going to turn as far as you can in one direction and see if you can get your chin to touch your collarbone. Tightness in the neck can actually hugely restrict shoulder turn. It's something that's often forgotten about. The mistake I'm showing here is I'm allowing my chest to turn as I turn my neck, which obviously makes it much easier and makes it look like I have more range of motion at my neck. The second issue here would be hiking up the shoulder to help me lower my neck, or to help me lower my chin towards my collarbone. And then the last one there would be hiking up the shoulder and going towards. Forearm rotation. These next ones are usually fine unless somebody has had a wrist or elbow injury in my experience. We have forearm rotation, then we have wrist hinge, and then finally we have wrist flexion and extension or cupping and bowing. They're mostly fine unless someone has had a wrist or elbow injury or forearm injury. The last one then is the glute bridge. So this looks at how well you can use use your glute, and also tests hip extension or glute strength. So feet and ankles together, you're going to bridge your hips up to the ceiling, then you're going to extend one leg. We're then going to try and get you to hold this position for 10 seconds and ask you where you feel it mainly. Ideally, you're getting it in the glute of the down leg. So when doing this test, you're testing the side that has the foot on the ground, not the side that has the foot extended or the knee extended out in front. I'll show you one or two of the common issues on this. So in a second, you'll watch me rotate from side to side, which is often just a sign that you're lacking a little bit of strength. So raising the leg up too high would be one issue, which makes it a little bit easier. Another problem would be the hips dropping too close to the ground, which have extended the leg, which would show a lack of strength. And then finally, you'll see the rotation here to the side.